Monday is here again, and I hope you guys enjoy this. There were a couple of people that asked if I could do something about head gaskets and how they blow and this kind of thing, and so I cobbled together a neat little presentation here for you. Hopefully you'll enjoy it and get something out of it. From my personal experiences, some few little surprises I ran into, and that kind of thing. That head gaskets are only one part of the big picture, and I do, cover a couple of little other things related to that in here. But let's go, and I want to start out talking about this 137 DKB Waukesha engine. When my dad was getting his sawmill set up, he bought the sawmill. It was used when he put it in place, which astonished me that he was able to do everything so perfectly the first time around, getting everything lined up, because the sawmill's not easy to put in if you want it to saw lumber that's the same on both ends. Anyway, there was a barge that belonged to the company I worked for when I was doing fleet maintenance in Texas, and it had a 1957 model 137 DKB Waukesha engine on it that was running a fuel pump sort of a thing. I don't know what exactly they had that engine doing on there, but they bought a 671 Detroit to replace it, because at one point this engine was old enough, even back then, that it needed a fuel pump spur, which is a little rubber thing that goes between the gear and the pump, and they had trouble finding one. They finally found one, put it in there, and then it started misfiring. And so the guy that was in charge says, well, we're going to go ahead and take this engine out of service, even though it still runs, and we're going to put it over here next to the fence. And there was, and we're going to put that 671 Detroit in place of it. So they took the power takeoff and the starter off of it, and they put it out there by the fence. Put the power takeoff on the 671 Detroit and hooked it up like it was supposed to be. I got an old power takeoff that didn't even fit this engine from a guy, and built an adapter for it and made it work, because what happened was Dad came down there and looked at it, and he goes, can we, the supervisor said, whoever wants that engine can have it, because he said, we don't have any use for it, and it's just sitting out there by the fence in the rain. And it sat out there for 3 months with it raining all over it, and the exhaust was open on it and everything. I didn't know what kind of shape it was going to be in, so loaded it on the truck. Me and Dad, I took it back to the house, and Dad got it running. Found out it was skipping on one cylinder. We pulled a valve cover off, and it had a broken push rod. And I actually fabricated a push rod right there at the house in my little shop for it. Adjusted a valve, and it ran really good. And we took that. I got a starter for it, a Lee Neville starter. The guy at Spence Battery built up for me, and a 8D battery, big old flat battery to start it. And anyway, we took it and put it over there. But he had a shop manual that he gave me with that. And where I was going with all this is, the shop manual states that this copper gasket, that this head gasket, was reusable. So all you had to do, if you had to pull the head off of this thing, you could wipe this head gasket off and clean it up real good, and wipe the cylinder head and the block off and reuse this gasket. That is totally against what we have been doing for all these years on vehicles, because you don't ever reuse a head gasket, unless you're just playing around. But I like to use, personally, for years, whenever I would put head gaskets on, I would use this here stuff, this copper coat gasket compound, but because it always seemed to me like a belt and suspenders way of making sure that you didn't have anything that caused you a problem later, And of course, everything's got to be really clean and pristine, and sand it and scrape it and make sure you feel of it with your fingers and shine a light across it, make sure there's no bumps. Really important to do that. Anyway, the head gaskets on these Tempos, whenever Tempo first came out, the earliest Tempos in 1984 had carburetors on them, but they also had problems with the head gaskets leaking right along here. It would the head gasket would seep oil out the front of that thing. This was a brand new engine on a brand new car that they were wanting to actually keep in position, and it lasted from 84 to 94. So for 10 years Ford made these Tempos. And there's some people that don't like Tempos and all that, but I always liked them because the engine was so dadgum tough. It has a cast iron block with a camshaft in the block and a cast iron cylinder head, And I had told that story one time about one of these, and I saw it got so hot that it had quit running and would stop beside the road, and the girl would wait till it cooled off and crank it up and drive it some more, and it came in everything. The reason it did that was somebody had poured nothing but clear water in it, and it had clogged the radiator up with rust and everything. So I replaced the radiator and put a thermostat in it, and the thermostat had turned blue. I mean, it had literally turned blue like you'd heated it with a torch. And that thing didn't burn any oil. And, you know, in other words, it didn't smoke. I say that. It didn't smoke. It didn't blow a gasket. It ran really good. Well, the Chevrolet version of this engine, which was a 2.5 that was in Cavaliers and stuff, you overheated. Now, they had a cast iron head too. But if you overheated one of them one time, it was done. Well, these things right here, as far as the base engine part of them, they were like half of an old V8. These things were just about bulletproof. But one way or another, whenever we would, the guys this was early enough that front wheel drive cars were just coming online, and the older mechanics at the Lincoln Mercury dealership did not like front wheel drive. They didn't like sideways engines and all that. And I had just gone to work there. I think they were paying me $12 a flat rate hour that time, and that was a pretty good bit of money back in 1983. So I sat here and I said, well, first time I put a head gasket on one of these, and there was a program Ford came out with, said, hey, we better replace these head gaskets because they had oil seeping down the front of the block. We don't want that vehicle to be known for that. And so what they had done was they built a head gasket for it and didn't put any tacky glue or anything on either side of it. It was just a good head gasket, but it didn't, the oil would wick out through the front of the head gasket and go down the block. So they were sending new gaskets that were a blue color that had this real sticky tacky stuff on them on both sides, and it was a different kind of a composite gasket. But the good news about these gaskets here was that I found out after I did the first one, I pulled the cylinder head completely off of it. It was paid 3.5 hours or something like that. And but I discovered, you know, in that old dealership where we worked, had a chain hoist that ran all the way on a track that ran all the way over a whole bunch of the service bays. And I found out that I could take the bracket loose from the back of the cylinder head where it hooked to the block, and just leave all of them vacuum hoses and everything hooked to that carburetor, because this was before they went CFI. There's a lot of vacuum hoses and stuff. You know, the vacuum hoses drive you nuts if you're, you know, it's time consuming putting those things back in. And I said, why don't I just see if I can take the valve cover off, the rocker arms off, take the push rods out, pull the head bolts out. With that bracket loose from the back, I hooked the engine hoist chain fall up to it, and I raised it up about 4 inches. And when I raised it up about 4 inches, I was able to slide that old gasket out of there, because it wasn't stuck to anything. Remember, it didn't have any glue on it. Not when they first built those engines, and these were brand new engines. I'd slide that thing out like a business card, and then I would reach my hand up under there, and I would feel of every square inch of the head and the block, and there would be nothing on it. It'd be smooth as it could be. It'd be just like pristine and brand new. And then I would take that blue gasket, the one they sent to replace it, and slide it under there. But I says, you know, I don't need this thing to be slightly out of line where I can't get the head bolt started and all this, because this tacky junk on this gasket, you know, is going to cause it to try to stay wherever you put it. And so you notice right here, they have these guide bolts that they're talking about in this thing here. Well, look at, the only problem with that was I had only raised the cylinder head up a little bit, and it was at a slight angle, and I could not use guide bolts that long, and I didn't have any anyway. But I did come up with something else that I could do to make this thing work the way I was doing it. And I could do one of these. They paid me 3.5 hours, and I could do one in 45 minutes, but doing it the way I chose to do it. And that's how we make our money when we're on commission, is we learn how to do the job right and a lot faster than the book calls for. Well, I took a head bolt, cut it off, and then I slotted it. Did that 2 times, and then I would take those bolts that I had made. They were my little homemade dowel pins, and I would screw it in like right here, and then maybe over here. All right, so I said, all right, that's cool. See how beautiful this motor is with that camshaft in the block and all that? You virtually never had to put a timing chain on one of them. But and the distributor goes right in here. Anyway, the long and the short of it was when I put those on there, I left them sticking up about probably 1/4 of an inch. And see, remember, they got this slot, which is, you know, that's in there for a reason, and I'm sure you know what it is by now. I screwed those bolts in there so they were sticking out just a little, and slide the gasket on there, and boom, it dropped right into place. And these things were locating that gasket. Furthermore, when I would lower the cylinder head back on there, these little things would kind of keep the cylinder head from touching the gasket until it was boom, dropped right into place. And then I would put the rest of the bolts in there, and then I would take a screwdriver and screw these little things out that I had made, and I would go down in there with my pocket magnet and pull them out of there, and then I would torque all the rest of the bolts and put it all back together. I mean, that was really kind of a fun job, and I loved seeing those come in, and I made me a ton of money doing those things, because it was one right after another I did. Of course, I only worked at the Lincoln Mercury place for about 4 months, because they didn't really have a lot of work, and Christmas was coming up and all that, and so I went over and took a different job after that. But long and the short of it was, that was the Tempo head gasket story. Now, granted, this was not a blown head gasket, but it was one that was leaking down the front of the block, and that's one thing. Now, what I want you to do here is listen to what's going on right here. That is what a blown head gasket acts like. It's pushing, keep doing it again. Pushing that smoke out there. And we also got a little bit of, do that again. Whenever you put the cap on, it pushes water out past that radiator hose, but it's definitely getting pressure in the cooling system. Head gasket time. Well, that particular vehicle there, that was what you see that smoke puffing out of that radiator. Puff, 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 puff. That's compression going into the cooling system. And you can actually smell that sweet, stinking stuff. This one here was bad enough that it wouldn't even start. And so we had to pull it off. Of course, when you pull the head off, you know, you need to go ahead and get it, take it to the machine shop. I mean, you gotta, it's okay, you can sand it off and look at it, whatever you want to. Sometimes you'll miss a crack. You know, the way they do cracks on cast iron cylinder heads is they basically sprinkle some iron filings on them and use a magnet. And whenever they do that, the iron filings will gather around any kind of a crack you wouldn't see. You can test pistons for cracks by just tapping on them real gently with the butt of your pocket knife. And if they go tink, 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 that's good. But if they go click, click, cluck, that means you found a crack. It doesn't sound the same. But basically, you're typically going to use new pistons most of the time anyway, if you're doing it the right way. Anyway, take your valve stem seals out of your gasket set, carry it to the machine shop, have them do a valve job on it. The machine shop I like to use, he's got a, whenever he does a valve job on a cylinder head, he puts that cylinder head in his resurfacing machine, and he makes a pass that's very, very, very light across that thing, just enough to where the surface of that cylinder head, he knows it's 100% flat, and he also knows that it doesn't have anything on it at all. It's like a brand new cylinder head. He wraps it in plastic and gives it back to you like you were buying a brand new cylinder head. I mean, this guy does really, really good work. Of course, it's Pilcher's Automotive. I've talked about them before. You can look them up. Boy, that's an incredible machine shop, and they do some astonishing things over there. Been there a long time. But let's look at this next little video here. Okay, what we did here, checking for a blown head gasket. On this 2001 Sebring, we got the spark plugs out, all of them except one. Then we spin the engine, and we see if the water jacket produces bubbles. And if the water jacket produces bubbles when we're spinning it, you know, we got it all the way full up. We pull the thermostat out, which is right under that cap, so we can see if we're getting bubbles. Spin it over. The compression that's in that number 3 cylinder is making its way into the water, and it's causing those bubbles. You can also see that it's kind of disturbing the water. And that is the number 3 cylinder. All right. That last scene there is actually a friend of mine in a town about 25 miles west of here. has got all of those vehicles lined up out there that are kind of collector's items that he got for some reason or another. You can look at those. It's pretty amazing what he's collected out there. But the point is, whenever you've got the compression making its way into the water, the compression's hot and it heats the coolant up, and that's where that pressure comes from. Now you can take a rubber glove and put over it and crank it up when it's cold and see how fast it inflates that rubber glove. What we used to do in my filling station days back in the mid-70s was we would crank one up that we suspected it was overheating, that we suspected was doing it because of the head gasket. And I used to tell people, you know, crank it up cold, hadn't been started, you know, for several hours. And, you know, of course, it's not going to have any pressure in the cooling system if it's just been sitting there and it's completely cold. Crank it up, run it for 60 to 70, maybe 80 seconds, switch it off. Take that radiator cap off. You should not have pressure in there. Not that soon. If you've got pressure in there, then there's a pretty good chance it's coming, you know, from the cylinders. Now, the first video I showed was one that's really bad. I mean, you could spin it over to see the steam puffing out of the radiator. This one was not as bad, but it was bad enough to make it overheat. And that was on cylinder number 3, as I remember, where that one was, and that was a Sebring. And we put head gasket on that, and, you know, it took the machine shop and all that kind of stuff, and it ran like a sewing machine when we got through. But anyway, this video, incidentally, is on my YouTube channel if you want to go back and look at it again. But I actually, you know, inserted it in here so we could watch it together. Now, this misfires on cold start only when it's head gasket related. The Winstars back in the mid-90s started giving this problem with the 3.8. This cylinder right here is number 4, because the way the cylinder number is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This number 4, for some strange reason, on a lot of these, started seeping water into the combustion chamber. And the way it would manifest itself is when you start it up, it would misfire cold. You know, start it up cold, it would misfire for about 30 seconds because the spark plug was wet. And it would take that long to dry the spark plug off. Once the spark plug dried off, it would start firing on that cylinder. And the only thing you might notice is a little bit of coolant loss over a period of time. But it was happening on so many of these. They came out with, you know, a program, and there's basically a recall, which is good for forever, a program which expires with time and mileage. You know, like in other words, past a certain date and past a certain mileage, they're not going to do that program on your vehicle anymore. And then there's technical service bulletins, and that doesn't mean it's under warranty. All it means is that, hey, this is something you may run into, you know. And so, but the final progression, the very first recall that was ever put out was the one on the Pinto, where it would probably bump into the back of it and the gas tank would fall off and catch fire and burn those cars up. Anyway, this one here, what they would have us doing was they had us checking the compression, which I thought was so stupid, because checking the compression is not going to reveal which cylinder is getting water. But so we would have to look at the spark plugs. If you see crusty little green stuff on the spark plug, and I'm talking about little green crusty deposits, that is coolant that has cooked and left deposits on there, and they keep building up. And you can kind of look at a spark plug if you're accustomed to it. I'll show you what those crusty green deposits look like on a piston in just a minute. But this particular one, what we had checking this compression was a little annoying if you hadn't done it a lot, because the plugs on the back, every single cylinder had to be checked. I mean, but I had a helper at the time. He was a high school kid that I was training. Me and him would, you could reach around the back of that engine, get those plug wires loose. You know, they're vulcanized to the plug a lot of the time. That's aggravating, but you work them off of there without tearing them up, and then jerk those plugs out. I used an air ratchet with a wiggle spark plug socket. Spin those plugs out of there. Check the, screw your compression gauge in, check the compression, write all those down on the work order, put it all back together and all that. But see, it wasn't our job to do anything other than check the compression. And it seems to me like that compression test paid an hour, according to the way that they were paying us on that recall thing. But me and my helper got to where we could do one of these in 18 minutes, believe it or not. We did so many of them, we got to where we were so fast we could knock them out in 18 minutes. But I had my own Jeep, the Misfire. It was doing that when it was hot. I would drive it all the way from work, all the way, and I'd pull it Winn-Dixie, and I'd go in and get some bananas, and I'd come back out and I'd crank it up, and it would be misfiring and flashing the check engine light for a little bit, and then it would clear up. And so I put up with that for a pretty good while. I got sick of it. And so finally, and I knew that cylinder number 3 on these is the one that likes to do that. And so what I did was, what you do is you switch it off while it's still running. And when you switch it off while it's still running, you pull the plugs out as quick as you can. In other words, you switch it off while it's still skipping. You crank it up, it'll be going bup, 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 and you switch it off. Don't let it quit skipping, switch it off. Pull it off. If you find one spark plug that's got steam coming off of it, you know that's the guilty cylinder, right? Make sure when you pull your spark plugs out, you lay them in order so you'll know which one came from where. That's just the smartest thing to do. Regardless of why you're doing it, I like to lay the plugs in order when I take them out, even when I'm doing a plain old spark plug swap. But anyway, this one here, mine, had a head gasket seeping, and the water, the coolant, was making its way from here past that fire ring in here. Now there was no compression going into the water. It wasn't causing an overheating problem. See, so that's one way. And nobody, whenever you have one like this, is skipping for a little while when you first start it. You don't know to start with if it is a leaking injector that's fouling the plug with gas, or if it's coolant. And either way, when you pull it out, if you see it steaming, you know it's coolant. If you see that it's wet with gasoline when you pull it out, then you'll know the injector's leaking. Now this is if you start it and it skips a little bit and then it clears up. And I never found that to fail me in finding either of it, a dripping injector, or of course a lot of times when the injector is dripping, the engine will start really hard because it'll wet a bunch of the plugs. But one way or another, that's another story. So anyway, I put a head gasket on this one here. Got that all straightened out, and it never gave that problem again. But that's a really close-up and sharpened picture of what that looks like. I will tell you this though, if you're not careful, you'll look straight at something like this when it's on the car and miss it. It takes a practiced eye to see it, and I like to shine a light across it from the side. And you make sure you use good light, shine it from every different direction so you can see your shadows, and you'll typically see something like this, rather than just missing it because you weren't paying attention, In other words, you got to look at detail whenever you're doing engine work like this. Now this 1998 Chevy 350 came to us. Now this guy was a retired General Motors guy, and he was a really nice guy. And you might be familiar with these poppet style injectors. They've got kits, which I actually put one on the pickup my dad used to drive that my son owns now, where you can actually put one on that's got electronic fuel injectors down here. What happens is, there's in this little assembly here, these little poppets will actually open up and let fuel go over here. I say poppets, they're little solenoids, a little bump will let go to these poppets here, and it will actually spray the fuel out. The crazy thing about this system here is it runs about 61 pounds of fuel pressure. And the crazy thing is, if one of these has only got 58 pounds of fuel pressure, there are times when it won't start. Or 56 or 50, you'd feel like 55, 57, 58 pounds of fuel pressure ought to be able to start anything. Well, because of the way these poppets work on one of these CSFI Chevys that were, lasted from the mid, like 96 to 01 or 02 or something like that, you better have enough fuel pressure. If you've got one that's not starting, and it ain't got but like 56 or 57 pounds of fuel pressure, you're probably going to wind up having to put a pump on it after you check the filter and stuff. So just be aware of that, because that thing can beat a lot of people up. They put the fuel pressure regulator right in there, and I thought that was interesting too, just an open hole, because it's exposed under that intake thing. You can see that this is actually upside down, to tell you the truth. So if you flipped it over, you'd see where the wire harness plugs in. I should have put a different picture on that. One way or another, This guy had gone to a lot of shops because he had an engine skip. He was also losing some coolant, which they didn't even factor that in, and every one of them said it was a problem with this this fuel injection spider. And the deal with that is, just because you've seen several of them that were skipping because of that and they're aggravating and hard to troubleshoot, you know, that doesn't mean that every one of these you see that's skipping is going to be a fuel injection spider. But that's what 2 or 3 different shops told him. When we went in there, all we did was pull the spark plugs out. And we found this rusty spark plug. And when you see a spark plug that's that dadgum rusty, you know there's been water and coolant getting in there. Now, typically when you see one rusty like this, it's because somebody has just got tired of adding antifreeze and just started pouring clear water in there. But this guy had a cylinder head crack that was letting coolant in there. Now, and you can see that this valve here, right over here, was starting to get rusty just like that plug. But this is an exhaust valve here. But anyhow, the long and the short of it was we had to put him a head on there. The crazy thing about it was, and this really made me kind of sick, this boy that was doing this, and this one guy, he was in my program and he was goofy as all get out. And one day I had a piece of 1/4-inch steel plate that had square edges on it. I had bought had a bunch of those cut for various different projects and things we were doing through the shop. Little 1/4-inch steel plate. It was about 3 inches square, and we needed the corners rounded off on it. And I told him, I pointed over to the bench grinder and I said, go to the bench grinder over there and round the corners off on this steel plate. And so I heard something running that didn't sound like the bench grinder. And when I looked over there, he had my valve grinding machine and he was using it for a bench grinder. Now you know what that's going to do to the rock. That's going to have to be redressed, because I was thinking, what the Sam hell are you thinking, kid? And so he said, oh, I didn't know. It's always what they say. And he went over there and then I told him never use the valve grinding machine for a bench grinder, because it was just right over there. I pointed at the bench grinder, he stopped at the valve grinding machine. Well, this same kid was test driving his truck and I don't even know how this is possible, but he was driving it down the road and the hood flew up and it bent the hood, which the guy didn't seem too terribly upset about that, but I was. And so I says, and how did it get past the safety latch? I mean, I don't understand how in the world the hood could pop up. And so anyway, this kid, he went on to, he went and got him an A&P license and he became an aircraft mechanic. Angels and ministers of grace defend us. I don't want that boy working on no aircraft that I'm flying in. But, of course he was, I think he was, he got a big paying job out there where they wash helicopters and play dominoes, working for the government, and he was just crowing about that, but he couldn't fix a ham sandwich. But anyway, this fire ring failure I talked about last week is something that happens, and it'll typically happen because of detonation, which comes from overheating. Like if one overheats a little bit, I don't know if you heard it or not, but you hear it lighting off the mix before the spark plugs fire because it's so hot in there. And whenever it does that, it causes that flame front to come up there and it can damage the fire ring, and the fire ring's all that's protecting the rest of that gasket. Now you might notice this gasket here is coated with graphite, and typically you're going to see gaskets, unless they're a multi-layer gasket like I'm going to show you in a minute, these gaskets that are used where the block is cast iron and the cylinder head is aluminum will be graphite, because the metals expand and contract at different rates, and if they didn't put some kind of graphite lubricant on that gasket, it would basically just scrub the gasket until it ruined it in a fairly short period of time. Because as those metals heat up, and different metals expand and contract at different rates, and that's a challenge for gasket makers. Anyway, there's that right there. And of course, this fire ring failure right here was something that I got a really good picture of that, and I was kind of proud of that. And typically, you're going to see a loss of compression there, and in some cases, depending on where it is, it'll burn the gasket up the rest of the way, and then you may even see it start puffing compression out between the head and the block. One time I had talked the other day about when I was putting the heads back on a 440 I rebuilt in a Chrysler New Yorker that belonged to me. I was young enough at the time to where I didn't think about fluid getting down in the head gasket holes and when I screwed the bolt back down in there on one of those holes had some fluid, a wall or antifreeze or something in it. When I screwed it down in there, I torqued it and it clicked, but that fluid kept it from going all the way down. And when I was driving it home right after I rebuilt it from the gas station, because I was working at that gas station in the mid-70s then, this thing blew the gasket right there where that bolt was, because that bolt didn't clamp down on the head, because the bottom of the bolt ran into some fluid at the hole, and it kept the shoulder of the bolt from coming down. Anyway, and I learned from that. Double fire ring failure. One of them will fail and then it punches through to the other one, and then you wind up with low compression on adjacent cylinders. That's not quite as interesting. You know, it's easy to find typically, because if you got two cylinders that have low compression, they're right next to one another, and you know, you can basically I like to take all the spark plugs out when I'm doing a compression test. But if you see compression puffing out one hole whenever the piston's coming up in the other hole, you kind of know what's going on there. You can actually take measures to do that. You could take a little piece of tissue or something and stick it in other spark plug holes except for the one that you're testing, and if you see it puff the piece of tissue out in the one next to it, you know you're going to be found something there. Now, multi-layer head gaskets are becoming more commonly used by serious rebuilders, and these are available for most engines now. And these things, if you notice, are kind of spring-loaded. They got 3 to 7 layers of embossed steel and a spring rate that reacts to cylinder head lift to maintain combustion and fluid seal. It works a lot better than a conventional composite head gasket. And they're kind of expensive, but they're a better head gasket than the old composite kind, if you can get some to fit the one that you're building. Now, these coolant passages are something a lot of people don't think about, but these are the coolant holes right here. And so you look at that, you think, well, that's a coolant hole, and since you look at the head and you look at and you might notice this has got dowels on it too, because it's a V engine, and whenever you set the head on there, you want it to stay put instead of trying to slide around. That's why those dowels are there. But anyhow, in other words, that's why you're putting the bolts in it. So these holes right here in the head are the same size as they are in the block. And they thought, well, the gasket ought to be made the same way. Well, that's not so. And if it is, you got a problem. The gaskets are made so that that hole chokes down that water flow through there, because it gives the coolant more time to draw heat out of the head before it returns and goes where it's supposed to go. So just keep that in mind whenever you're seeing it. And the reason I'm saying that, there was a Fel-Pro gasket set one time that came when we were putting head gaskets on a 3.8 in a Taurus. And the guy that was over there, he was smart enough to where he took the old gaskets and he laid it on the table, and he laid the new gasket next to it, which is always a smart thing to do, regardless of what gasket. Look at your old gasket and your new one, unless the old gasket says all the pieces. Well, the head gasket is going to be intact enough to where you can lay them side by side on the bench. And he called me over there, and what he noticed was that the holes where the coolant went through was cut exactly like they were in the head and the block. And this is a Fel-Pro gasket set. And so I said, do not use those gaskets, because if that water goes through there too fast, it's going to burn that thing up, and we're going to have to eat it. And so I says, I called the part store, and I says, call Fel-Pro for me and ask them if this is supposed to be this way, and did they know about this? And so he got on the phone, he called Fel-Pro, and he called me back, and he said Fel-Pro was terrified by what you said you found there. And he says, they want those gaskets back, and I'm sending you another set of gaskets. And when he did, the other set of gaskets had small holes like these right here. And that was just, you know, words to the wise. You know, you can actually think you're doing everything right, but if you got a gasket that's cut wrong, make sure the holes are all in the same place, because if they're in a different place, it might clog, you know, you might prevent stuff from flowing where it's supposed to flow and all that. Finally, we got these pressurized oil feed passages, and I talked about this last week. You see how that is the Volkswagen Rabbits were the first ones that I saw with that, the overhead cam diesels and gas burning Rabbits. Except theirs are right in the middle, in the front. It's got a rubber seal that where that oil flows through, and that's where this leak was. You remember I told you last time. The oil flows through that head, see, here's the head gasket, this would be the head gasket right here, and so it flows through that head gasket into there to lubricate those cam saddles. Now some of them will actually have a little pipe above the cam saddles, and it'll just spray oil on the, you know, everything while it's working and whatever. But these right here, these pressurized oil feeds, since it goes through there, this is a possible leak point, and so pay attention to that. And so I hope y'all like that diagram. I actually put that together myself, and it took a long time and it was real aggravating, but I did it. Anyway, that's another way that gaskets can fail. And you guys probably got some stories of some different ways they can fail, but the simple fact is you can't just say a blown head gasket always causes the same problem, because the simple fact is it doesn't. And so that's going to finish us up for today, and I hope you guys got something out of this that you could chew on. And so I'm going to let you guys go, and hey, let's be careful out there.